parsed, that is read top to bottom, left to right by a browser, loaded into memory as an actual data structure, namely a tree. This is what it might look like inside of your computer's RAM. And this is a useful way of thinking about it, because now that as we begin to dive into JavaScript, JavaScript is increasingly being used to take a tree like this and massage it into a different tree, adding nodes, subtracting nodes. Already, if you're a Facebook user or a Gmail user, things happen quite dynamically these days. If you get an email with Gmail, the whole page does not reload, certainly these days. Instead, you just get a new row in the middle of the web page. That row is probably a tr or something like that inside of a table tag, maybe, or maybe it's a div, but something like that. How is Gmail updating the inside of its web page? It's using JavaScript to insert more rectangles like these somewhere into the middle of the page. Facebook, when you get a Facebook chat or a status notification or a tweet that pushes everything else down, what's happening? This language called JavaScript is inserting a new node or rectangle into the tree and pushing everything else down or to the side, depending on how the programmer decided to do it. So that's what's been happening all this time underneath the hood, and we'll see how to do that ourselves momentarily. So JavaScript. How do you go about writing JavaScript? Well, historically, it runs client-side inside of a browser. So if you've got a website written in PHP or Python or Ruby, you might have JavaScript in that site, but it's not getting executed by your server. It's being sent to the server via HTTP over the internet, and then the browser is reading that JavaScript code just like it reads the HTML, top to bottom, left to right, and executing it on your own Mac or PC. So where do you put the JavaScript? Well, we've seen already you can have script tags. We haven't seen them with stuff in between, but the simplest way to start writing JavaScript, as we'll see, is to just put it inside of an open script and a closed script tag, just like that. But of course, you're probably more familiar already with this format. Just to recap, what does this line of HTML do? What does it tell a browser to do? Exactly. Load file.js and treat it as a file containing JavaScript code. So if there's code in it, it should be executed, top to bottom, left to right. So we'll see how to actually embed that in a web page. What about the language itself? Here I'm going to take a shortcut and just wave my hand at all of the syntactic features of JavaScript. Why? Most of these keywords, if not all of them, are probably familiar to you no matter what language you've actually used before. A couple might be new, might not have used the for-in construct before, might not have used try-catch if you're not familiar with exceptions, might not have seen var before, but it's just what we use to declare a variable. But you can probably guess what most of these do. So break is usually used inside of a loop or a switch to break out of it. And we'll go through this quickly. These are the details we'll come back to over time as needed. And any number of online references can reinforce. Const specifies that it should be a constant value. Continue means to do another iteration of a loop without necessarily proceeding further down below the line of code. Do while means do something again and again, but check the condition at the bottom instead of at the top. For starts a loop. For in is useful when you want to iterate over an array. It's just a shorthand way of typing out a traditional for loop, as we'll eventually see. Function says here comes a function. It's you have to explicitly say here comes a function with that keyword. If else, got to be familiar. Return, got to be familiar. Switch is just a different way of writing an if, else if, else if, else statement. Throw relates to exceptions. You'll see these a little bit in JavaScript, but we won't spend much time on them. They're also present in iOS, but not super commonly used, at least in the APIs we'll mostly spend our time in. But it's a way of handling errors. Instead of returning -1 or returning false or null or some sentinel value like that, throw and try and catch are mechanisms in languages like JavaScript that allow your code to just throw up an error, and typically they'll kill the program unless you have written code defensively to catch a potential such thrown exception. And we'll see if these come up today or in the future. Var lets you declare a variable, and while just starts a loop. And there's a few other things, but the rapidity with which we just went through that is just to suggest that JavaScript, even if new to you, is probably pretty familiar based on most any other language you've used. How do you declare an array? So an array, what's really nice about JavaScript is that it makes nice use of syntactic sugar, which means using shorthand notation to do common things. Open square bracket, close square bracket gives you an empty array. You can also write out the word array, capital A-R-R-A-Y, open paren, close paren, calling effectively a constructor for the array class. But it's not really called a constructor, and it's not really called a class. So the more common way of seeing it anyway is just to have open bracket, square bracket. So we'll see that in some examples eventually. And to get an empty object, we use curly braces. And we're back. So let's go about actually implementing some simple JavaScript examples, working our way up to more compelling examples, particularly ones that leverage some mobile-specific features. For instance, we'll leverage a feature of HTML5 that's particularly useful in a mobile context if you want to store data persistently, even offline potentially without internet access, called local storage. We'll also take a look at the geolocation API, which allows you in JavaScript code to ask the browser and in turn the iOS phone or iPad or iPod, where am I in the world, and actually get back some GPS coordinates and also a measurement of just how accurate that estimation is. So let me go back to the sample code for tonight. I'm inside of the JS directory. And let me go into the dom0.html file. So again, if you go to cs76.net, if you haven't already, you can download all of this code to play along at home. And if you pull up this page, you get a super simple example. It apparently is a form with a text field and with a form field. And let me go ahead and view the page's source so we can see what's going on underneath the hood here. And let's first focus on what's familiar. Let me scroll to the bottom, and we see a body tag. We see inside of that body a form tag, an ID. What's an ID attribute used for if you've not used it before? Or if you have used it before? Exactly. So if you've not used it before, the ID attribute, which can be applied to most any HTML tag, allows you to uniquely identify it in the DOM. It's totally the honor system. It's up to you, the developer, to make sure that you don't give any other element the same ID, but it allows you to have quick access to a particular element, not only in CSS and in your style sheets, but also, as we'll see, in JavaScript code. So you don't have to go searching through the whole tree trying to find a node of interest. So we'll come back to onSubmit. Let's dive into input. So I have apparently given an ID of name to an input tag that has a placeholder. So this is interesting. It turns out that in HTML5, there's actually a few useful attributes that you might not have seen before. So let's actually suspend this thread for just a moment. Let me go back into our earlier directory just to make sure folks have seen this. And if I go into inputs.html, notice this too is a form without even a submit button, because my goal isn't to submit this form, but just to demonstrate different types of form fields. Now they're going to wrap a little bit because the lines are long, but notice in this form I have 3 input tags, and I've got an auto capitalize equals quote unquote off attribute. You can probably guess what that does. Tells the phone, in most cases, don't try auto capitalizing this, which can be annoying. Autocomplete equals quote unquote off. That just disables the little drop down that will often appear if you previously type something into the field. It's pretty common on desktop browsers. Autocorrect equals off. Increasingly helpful on mobile devices and also supported on more and more desktop browsers. Just means don't correct my spelling. Placeholder equals quote unquote. That puts what in the text box? Yeah, placeholder text, like grayed out text that's there until you click on it or start typing. So it's just useful for instructions. And then finally, type. This is interesting too. This first one has type equals text, which is old school. But notice in HTML5, you can have type equals email and type equals URL. Now, that does not mean that the browser is going to validate the field for you. You can type in any word you want into an email field, and you won't get yelled at just because it doesn't look like an email address. Similar for the URL. You can type in any word you want, even if it's not a URL. The browser is not going to yell at you. So why in the world would the browser care what type of field this should be?
Does Safari add the @ symbol to email?
What do you mean add the @ symbol?
Like in the keyboard.
So the keyboard, but not my physical keyboard.
No, but if you're on an iPhone.
Yeah, so indeed, let's go back to Safari in the simulator here. Let's go back to the directory listing and go to inputs. And now notice what happens. If I click on the first of these inputs, the very top one was just type equals text, notice that I get this keyboard. OK, pretty uninteresting. Done. Now if I click on the email field, let's see how good your recall is. What changed? So you get a smaller space bar and the @ sign there. So it's just for the user's convenience. And what are we probably going to see if we instead dismiss this and click the URL field? Exactly. It changes ever so slightly, and I also get the slash for easy access. So it's just a little bit of icing on the cake for the user to make it easier to interact with your site. All right, so now let's go back to the example we were at before, which was not this one here, but with just the dom0 file in the JS directory that looked like this. So notice at the bottom, I've added a couple of other things to the input tag. Placeholder equals quote unquote name, just to be explanatory. Type equals text, so no special keyboards. Finally, an input of type equals submit. But there's something else here that you might not have used before, but you can probably guess what it does. This attribute called onSubmit presumably tells the browser to call a function called greet when the form is submitted. How do you submit a form? Well, you either click the physical submit button, or if you're on a desktop computer, you hit the enter key. That will often do it as well. So in either case, the act of submitting a form happens. But with this onSubmit attribute, you're telling the browser, listen for that event, so to speak. And JavaScript and web programming more generally is very much event-driven. When that form is submitted, an event happens. And onSubmit is an event handler, a listener that's waiting to hear that event of submission. And what should it do? Well, we don't know much JavaScript yet, most likely, but it looks like code. And indeed, I should call a greet function with no arguments. And then I should return false. And we'll come to back to greet in a second. Return false. What would that possibly mean, to return false inside of an attribute inside of a form tag?
Probably to prevent submission.
Exactly. So what might you want to stop when a form is submitted? Well, the form being submitted itself to the server. If the whole point right now is to start writing code that runs on the client side, inside of the browser, we don't even need a server once we've downloaded the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript, right? We can lose internet connectivity altogether, potentially, if all of the code is running locally on my phone or iPad or iPod right now. So onSubmit just says, call the greet function, but no matter what happens, do not actually submit this form. So it's your chance to intervene. So now let's scroll up to the top of the file. Most of it's pretty boring, HTML, title tag, head tag, and all of that. But notice toward the top of the file, I've introduced that script tag. And then I've put right there in the script tag, function greet. So we promise that the function keyword means here comes a function. Then open paren, close paren means it takes no arguments. Open curly brace, close curly brace defines the scope of the function. And it's a one-line function. Turns out in JavaScript, there's a function that's super useful, but not to be used in production code, that just opens a pop-up. If you remember 8, 10 years ago, when pop-ups were very much in vogue and alerts were very much in vogue, that's how you invoke them. That's one way of opening prompts on a user screen. So what is this going to do? Well, let's take a quick glance at some syntax, but you can probably guess what this is doing based on other languages. It's wrapping a bit because the line is long, but this is calling alert, passing in a single argument of type string. So JavaScript does have the notion of data types, as we'll see. Quote, unquote, with a comma, hello. And what do you think the plus is doing? Concatenation. So you've seen this in Java. If you're a PHP programmer, you've seen dot. Other languages use different symbols. Now, document.getElementById of name. Now, I had no idea until a second ago that function existed, but it seems that a function called getElementById exists. It's associated with some kind of global variable called document. So more properly, it's a method inside of an object called document. What is that object called document? Well, if we go back to the screen from earlier, recall that, the document node. If you've programmed JavaScript already and you ever use document.something, you've essentially been talking to that guy who has some special functionality built in. And clearly he's important because he can see the entirety of the tree from his vantage point. So if we now go back to my own code, document.getElementById does exactly what you think it does. Give me the element from the tree. Give me the rectangle whose ID is quote unquote name, which is what type of element, just to be clear? Not a string per se. What type of HTML element was it? An input. So give me the rectangle that represents the input whose ID is name in that tree structure. Why? Because I then want to dive in deeper and get its value. So here's the object-oriented nature of JavaScript. The dot means go inside of this object, go inside of this object, and get some member function or member variable, data field. So document's an object. It has a method called getElementById. That method returns, apparently, an object, a rectangle, that represents that node from the tree. And one of its properties, something inside of that rectangle, is apparently a property, a data field, data value, whatever you want to call it, an instance variable called value. That gives you the value that the user typed into that field. So what is the net effect, in layman's terms, of this line of code? To trigger an alert with what text? hello so-and-so, whatever your name actually is. So let's give this a try. Let's go back to the web page itself. Let me go ahead and type in